Welcome back. You're still with us. Now, in another video, we explored the dimensions of inequality and we introduced two important concepts. One was multidimensional inequality, and secondly, how spatial inequality helps us understand what to respond and why cities are so important. To really ground that approach, what we want to do is we want to travel to Cape Town and we want to just look at some statistical data about the city to really bring home why multidimensional inequality is such a powerful force in structuring cities. So allow me to walk you through a few stories about Cape Town. So the first is a really interesting 3D representation of intensity or density. The one map of Cape Town shows employment density, and there is a peak right in what we call the central business district part of the city. This is where most of the formal jobs in Cape Town are, where most of the economy is anchored, and that fans out along two axes. One is a northern axis and the other is a southern axis. Now, if you contrast the red peaks, which is employment density, with the red peaks in the second map, which shows residential density, you'll see that they are in completely opposite parts of the city. Residential density is code, in the case of this map, for people who live in informal settlements in Cape Town. And these informal settlements and informal housing is both in freestanding informal areas, but also in what we call the backyards of public housing or RDP housing in the case of South Africa. And what that reflects is that you've got much higher concentrations of people living in these homes than you have in people living in the suburbs of the city, which is closer to the economic opportunities. Now, the point is that those people in the red peaks that shows residential densities need to use public transport to get to where the jobs are. And that can be a 2 to 3 hour journey per day. And because of the expense of public transport, it could chow up to 30% of their monthly incomes. In other words, they are disadvantaged to access employment opportunities just because of where they live and what the cost of public transport is to get to work. And of course, imagine if you live in one of those informal settlements and you're one of the young people between 15 and 24 that makes up the 62% of unemployed in Cape Town, you just don't have the income to go and look for work because of the expense of public transport. Now, what is going on here? What we have is we have a set of forces from both the public sector and the private sector that reinforces how value is distributed in the city. So value tends to be much higher where jobs and the economy is anchored, and much lower in informal settlements where lots of people live. And what this shows is how value in the investment in real estate property has grown over a 10-year period between 2005 and 2015 for mixed use, commercial and industrial investments. And as you can see, most of the bubbles sit in the middle to the northern part of the city and in the CBD, which is that big blue bubble. And there's almost nothing in what we call the southeast component of the city. And surprise, surprise, where do the most of the poor people live in the city? In the southeast. That's where more than half of the city's population is concentrated, and that half of the city's population mostly fall below the poverty line. And this raises the question, is there an investment strike in that part of the city? Is the private sector just not willing to go there? And that indeed is what the data is telling us. And so what we know is that the private sector is only investing at the edges of the city. So this map shows us where the private market is investing in real estate. So the orange bubbles shows to the north of the city that there's expansion to the northern part of the city, and then also to the east and western parts of the city. But what's significant about this is that it's the exact opposite places to where the state is investing. So when you look at state investment, it is in that southeast core of the city where the majority of poor people live. And the reason for this is that that's where public housing and some basic infrastructure is going to deal with water, to deal with sanitation and so forth. So let's flip back to that private investment map, and then let's consider where the state is investing. So what you have here is you have a city that is being pulled in two opposite directions by different kinds of investments, and that reinforces spatial inequality in Cape Town. Now, to understand how this actually works in terms of the kinds of societies and communities and social mobility dynamics it sets up, I've produced the summary diagram. So what we know is that if you're young, if you're born in a working class or a poor neighborhood in Cape Town, you face economic exclusion. So that is as a consequence of economic inequality. Secondly, if you fall in that category that you don't have a job and you're poor, you're also likely to have limited access to basic services. And the schools that your children will go to will be overcrowded, the teachers will be underqualified, and the likelihood of them actually completing high school is relatively low. And also, if you need access to public health facilities, you can have that access, but the quality of service that you will get will be significantly lower than if you live in a suburb and you have access to private healthcare. And the third factor, which is often not captured by the statistics and by the data and the maps, is something which is more intangible. And that is that if you live in one of these areas, your culture, your identity effectively gets devalued and it gets erased in the city. One example from Cape Town. About 42% of the city's population comes from a cultural group called Xhosa. And the young men in that tradition, as part of their transition to adulthood, have to go through a very sacred ritual of initiation. They require to be in the wild, to be in nature, and to be removed from society. Even though that cohort of Cape Town's population make up more than a third of the population of the city, there is absolutely no public infrastructure to enable this absolutely critical cultural experience of identity building and community building. And that's one example of cultural erasure. There are many, many other examples of how people who live in working class communities are simply not seen, not validated, and not empowered to be their best selves. And it is that cultural erasure combined with economic exclusion and poor access to social development infrastructure that produces what we call stunted social mobility. In other words, if you are born in one of these neighborhoods, the possibility of you transitioning to a better job, to a better life, is very, very limited because all of these factors work against your social mobility. And that's what we call the vicious spatial concentration of disadvantage and inequality. And the tragedy of this is not that there's societal or political outrage, but it is that the people who live in those contexts, they feel there's something wrong with them. They suffer from a crisis of meaning and identity because they think that they are responsible for the challenging conditions they live in. And this is part of how that abstract map about multidimensional inequality translates into spatial inequality. And I hope that this example from Cape Town, which is a brutal and stark reminder of the lives that are impacted by these factors, that I hope that this will energize you to really understand how multidimensional inequality plays out in your city and what might be the most effective ways to use spatial inequality as a lever to shift those dynamics.